So my name is Sarah Byrne-Martelli. I am the OCAMPR secretary, and I'm a member of the executive board. I am the palliative care and hospice chaplain at Mass General Hospital in Boston. And I have the honor of introducing our speaker today, Dr. Nina Glibetic. Dr. Glibetic is an assistant professor of liturgical studies at the University of Notre Dame. Her main research area is Christian liturgy in the pre-modern world, especially in the Orthodox tradition. Her work is interdisciplinary and pulls from the fields of liturgiology, theology, Byzantine and Slavic studies. Glibetic's research and publications have explored topics such as the development of Byzantine Eucharistic liturgy in the late Middle Ages, the role of liturgy in the formation of national identity, medieval religious rites for women at childbirth and miscarriage, and the liturgical heritage of early Slavs between East and West. Dr. Glibetic has lectured internationally and held numerous research appointments, including a membership at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and fellowships at Harvard's Dumbarton Oaks, the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She is concurrently a member of an interdisciplinary research team dedicated to studying the liturgical manuscripts discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai in 1975. In 2021, Pope Francis appointed Professor Glibetic as a consultant to the Congregation for Eastern Churches, making her one of a small number of Orthodox people to serve in this capacity. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Okay, it's great to be here today. It's my first time coming to this meeting, and so far it's been quite stimulating for me to be in a very different kind of intellectual environment. But since my work is in so many ways interdisciplinary, and since liturgical studies as a field is quite interdisciplinary, I feel myself at home also as an intruder. Okay. As a scholar of Christian liturgy, I am used to wearing multiple hats. And the hat I wear most often is that of a historian of the Byzantine Rite. So my research is especially focused on the history of the Eucharist, where I worked with primary sources from the medieval world, such as liturgical manuscripts and sacred art, in order to trace how Christians have worshipped over the centuries and what this worship signified theologically. I have also worked on a range of liturgical rites pertaining to women, and most recently I explored a late medieval rite that continues to be preserved in the modern Orthodox service books, familiar to many of you, I'm sure, intended for a woman after an interruption of pregnancy, either due to stillbirth, miscarriage, or intentional abortion. This and other rites of passage are interesting because they explore the ways in which the Church pastorally accompanied people through key transitional or otherwise challenging moments in their lives. These rites also provide the Church with an opportunity to step into what anthropologists call a liminal moment in the lives of people. That is to say, a moment of significant personal transition, such as childbirth and marriage, and fill this raw moment with theological significance. Now today, I wish to take a different approach. My paper today will focus on a subject that I find quite interesting and which I hope will be also relevant to many of you, namely human memory. More specifically, I will highlight some key conclusions about human memory drawn from the natural sciences, if you permit me, especially cognitive psychology and neuroscience, and bring these conclusions in conversations with notions of memory stemming from liturgical theology. I chose this route because I'm convinced that natural sciences have a lot to teach theology about the specifics of our mental processes. I am thus curious to hear your thoughts and reactions, given that many of you work in the fields of psychology and neuroscience. At the same time, I also chose this topic because it is very much tied up with the theme of this year's conference, Living Liturgically in Practice. Memory is deeply tied up with human identity, and liturgy has the potential to dramatically impact our memory. Liturgy in this way extends beyond the sacramental act into the remaining space of human life. Ultimately, in shaping memory, liturgy can transfigure life into worship. Now, in my paper, I will first focus on memory from the perspective of natural sciences. Next, I will describe a specific type of Christian remembrance that is rooted in the liturgy. This theological vision of remembrance was particularly developed by the influential 20th century Orthodox theologian Alexander Schmemann. Now, lastly, my paper will bring together natural memory, Christian remembrance, and the liturgy. My aim in this paper is to examine the ways in which natural memory is affected by the liturgy. And in shaping our memory, liturgy also sculpts our identity, both in the church building and beyond. And so, natural memory. Let us begin looking at natural memory through a poem written by a contemporary African-American poet, Aaron Petre, entitled Nostalgia. Sometimes I put on my favorite song, and as the music plays, the melody builds a vessel that moves me through time to an outer space deep within, where I was restless and hungry, small, green, and sweet, and for a moment, 4 minutes, 59 seconds to be exact, my feelings smell like fresh-cut grass, and I am overcome. Now, in this poem, Petre describes an experience familiar to many of us. Something awakens a memory from the recesses of our identity, and this memory transports us, like a vessel, into the past, or better yet, into our recollection of the past. This act of remembering is colored by feelings and sensations so vivid that we almost smell and taste this present past. Petre's poem highlights the timelessness or multidimensionality of memory. Far from a mere depository of past events or fragments of knowledge, memory unfolds in the present, stretches into the past, and looks towards the future. Now, viewed from this perspective, natural memory closely resembles the liturgical action of the Church, and especially its central component, the liturgical remembrance of Christ's death and resurrection in the Divine Liturgy, known as the anamnesis, which too transcends the boundaries of time. Neuroscience has long been fascinated by how animal brains remember. This field has shown that while human memory can function in similar ways to other animals, it is also distinct. Most recently, researchers at the Center for the Study of Cultural Evolution at Stockholm University conducted a meta-analysis of nearly 100 memory experiments on 25 different species. They came to a straightforward conclusion. Whereas different animal species can encode specialized memories, for example, an animal remembering the location of nuts it stored months earlier, or an animal recognizing other animals it had not seen in years, humans are unique in their exceptional ability to recall the events and associated experiences that form specialized memories. In other words, humans possess a uniquely broad memory ability that has enabled language, writing, and civilization as we know it. But what is natural memory? Well, the words memory, to remember, recollection, and remembrance all relate to the broad topic of memory. They highlight its different aspects. The term memory designates both the phenomenon of memory as such and a specific human faculty. In this latter case, memory has to do with a particular capacity, thus with the subject who is remembering. On the other hand, a memory with an article refers to what is brought to mind and denotes that which is being remembered. Now, the verb to remember is the ability to retain or recall a memory. Here, one can discern two meanings. The first occurs when a particular memory is born. One retains some person, fact, event when forming a new memory. Neuroscientists and psychologists draw attention to the steps involved in memory formation. The process usually begins when an external stimulus activates our senses. The stronger the stimulus, the more likely the memory formation and its long-term retention. Memory formation is strongest when multiple senses are engaged or when there is intense emotional activation. Memory formation is also strengthened when one intentionally chooses to focus and remain present to an experience. Now, the second meaning of the verb to remember denotes remembering in the present something from the past. An external stimulus usually activates this process as well. Think, for example, how a particular smell can almost instantaneously make present an event or sensation from the past. This second meaning is closely related to the roots of the term remember. One brings back and reconstructs an experience that has been broken up when stored in the deposits of our memory. Neuroscience has shown that different parts of the human brain hold different kinds of memory knowledge, such as visual and sensory input, emotions, or conceptual factual knowledge. The amygdala, for example, is typically believed to attach emotional significance to memories and thus help encode memories with a sense of joy, shame, or grief. When we remember a past experience in the present, we remember. That is to say, we put together the memory that has been deconstructed in our minds. Related is the distinction between short-term and long-term memory put forth by cognitive psychologists. Much can be said about these two memory types. For us, it suffices that short-term memory retains information during ongoing cognitive activities, such as having a conversation or reading a book, whereas long-term memory implies lasting retention of knowledge and experiences. Psychologists also draw a distinction between implicit memory, which is unconscious and lies behind most of our activities, including those essential to daily life, like walking and driving a car, and explicit memory, which requires conscious effort and involves the encoding of factual and biographical data. This distinction is even reflected on the physical level, since different parts of the brain are associated with these two operations. And proof is found in Alzheimer's patients who at certain stages of the disease may be able to drive a car, yet soon after entering the vehicle may lose track of their intended destination. So it should already be apparent that far from involving a merely passive storage of information, memory is multifaceted, a dynamic faculty extending into every aspect of human life. Explicit memory has a quality of recollection, that is, willingly bringing back into the consciousness previous life experiences. Usually the memories brought back to mind are related thematically and not chronologically. And recollection results in a new memory, a process that Augustine describes with the phrase memory of memories. Something in the present prompts a person to retrieve their memories, and only memories stimulated by the prompt come to mind. Neuroscience reveals that an individual not only remembers things through their own conscientious desire to recollect. Recollection may occur because of an unwilled memory. The brain recalls memories through various stimuli, such as visual prompts or tactile sensations that trigger a memory. Our sense of smell is located in the olfactory bulb of the brain, which lies adjacent to the amygdala and hippocampus, two key parts of the brain for the storage of memory. And this might explain how certain smells can trigger very intimate emotional memories, as alluded to in our opening poem by Aaron Petre. In Augustine's words, unless the memories were dug up by some reminder, I would perhaps have been unable to conceive them. Such unsolicited memories often result in an individual choosing to sit with the memory and conscientiously recollect the past. Recollection makes evident that memory is not restricted to the passive storage and retrieval of experience and knowledge, but is a dynamic and interpretive faculty. Because humans are thinking beings and their life takes place in historical time, the interpretation of our memories changes as we change, as we grow and mature. Pondering on the qualities of faded childhood memories, the poet William Wordsworth writes, quote, "The things which I have seen, I can now see no more," a phrase from his poem that inspired the title of my paper. One is unable to experience an event in the same way as before because no same moment can ever be recreated. Our memory is always selective and retains only a part of an experience. Nor are we the same when the memory was formed. Subsequent life experiences and novel settings incite new triggers which challenge the previous meaning of our memories. On a physical level, each new memory shifts the neurological associations in our brain, showing the porous nature of human identity. As the bioethicist and theologian Melander writes, quote, "Each of us is constantly active in memory, constructing and reconstructing the story of his or her life." Now, the interpretive quality of memory is essential to personal identity. Humans exist and discover their personhood in time, in the experiences through which life manifests itself. Memory helps us restructure, interpret, and reinterpret anew, discern patterns in the story of our lives. Without memory, humans are unable to draw connections, similarities, and contradictions between the many events through which they construct a life story. Such a life would be characterized by a process of unrelated and isolated events, each always new. Essential ingredients of human life would also be absent. For example, one could not follow a storyline of a novel, a film, a person recounting an event. All activities that make up the human unique among animals. Human relationships as we know them would be inconceivable, since human relationships are based on a history two or more people shares. Put simply, one would lose their self and perpetually remain trapped in an unrelated procession of events. Now, memory also extends beyond the remembering subject and has to do with discerning the world. In fact, these two aspects of human life, discovering our identity and discovering the world, are interrelated. Though there is such a thing as the subjective experience of space and time, both are the setting where the life of creation takes place. In the words of the former Pope Benedict XVI, time is first of all a cosmic phenomenon. Humans live with the stars. There is no such thing as private space and time, and there is no such thing as an experience of the self without the other. Memory extends beyond the remembering subject because it always preserves experiences taking place in shared space and time. Just as memory helps interpret personal experience, so it helps interpret the environment of personal experience. In turn, the environment of personal experiences influences the interpretive quality of memory. Without memory, humans could not make sense of the space and time of human life. So similarly, memory cannot be locked up in the life of one person because every life involves the life of other. On the most basic and physical level, each breath we take depends on an entire ecosystem around us, and each word we utter depends on the cultures that produced it and the people who imparted it upon us. When we reflect about the many events that shape the story of our life, we reflect through the eyes of the culture or cultures, language or languages, the geographies and the histories to which we belong. Others also shape our autobiographical memory. Childhood memories are always influenced by the tales others tell of us. When we reminisce about a person from our past, we bring into that memory the dynamics of the whole relationship. All this reveals memory as extending beyond the remembering subject. Now memory, natural memory, not only extends into the lives of others, but also into the future. We form memories so that we do not lose experiences, so that we do not forget. While the drama of human life takes place in the present, every moment, in the phrase coined by the psychologist Stephen Kreitz, enfolds in a tensed present. As temporal, incarnate beings, humans bring their past into the present, and their present, in turn, conditions their future. Neuroscience describes this relationship between memory and temporality on a physical level. Humans carry their memories principally via neurons in the brain charged with this task. One cannot but carry the past into the present, because their past is physically inscribed into their bodies. Cognitive psychologists such as Daniel Schachter explain the future orientation of memory in evolutionary terms. We remember what will be useful for our survival and advancement in the future. Sometimes this process is intentional, though usually it is automatic and remains on the unconscious level. Now, theologians, on the other hand, describe the future orientation of memory by associating memory with theological hope. For example, Jacobs writes, quote, "If memory is the essential retrospective faculty, it will only be exercised by those who think such retrospection is potentially valuable. That is, for those who are hopeful. Hope is the virtue that prompts the exercise of remembrance. We hope that our lives make sense, that they have meaning. Hope links retrospection to prospection. It reminds that whenever we're looking back, we are simultaneously moving forward. In Jacobs' words, memory, quote, is always influenced by the way our prospective imagination is throwing us forward into the future. But the future, however, remains unknown, which characterizes human memory with a certain degree of mystery. And given the integral connection between memory and identity, our life too is thus also characterized by mystery. So we're left with one term to define of the list that I gave at the start of this paper. And this term, more than the others, reveals the place of memory in Christian life. This term is remembrance. The Orthodox the Oxford English Dictionary defines remembrance as, quote, memory or recollection concerning a particular person or thing, a commemorative discourse or mention, a memorandum. Remembrance most commonly denotes the act of remembering something or someone in a favorable light, such as a person once known or a book read and greatly enjoyed. Remembrance can imply friendship or keeping others in prayer, as is shown in the ministry of St. Paul, who frequently made mention of other churches and who is in their remembrance. Given these characteristics, it should come as no surprise that remembrance has theological significance. The Orthodox theologian Alexander Schmemann's description of memory is particularly useful here, since it provides a good entry point into the topic of the relationship between Christian worship and memory. This is because Father Schmemann sees Christian remembrance as expressing, quote, the essence of the new life given to humans in Christ. So like Augustine and other theologians before him in East and West who commented on natural memory, Father Schmemann describes human memory as a mystery, as an inexplicable gift. Memory revives the past. I quote, "One thing is without doubt. Memory is the human capacity to resurrect the past, to preserve knowledge of it within oneself." Now, what makes this faculty ambiguous is that the act of remembering is accompanied by the realization that this event was a once-for-all event. Remembering the past implies an absence, and this absence leads humans to confront their own temporality. In Father Alexander's words, in the end, memory in humans is nothing other than the knowledge, peculiar only to them, of death, of the fact that death and time rule on earth. While some neuroscientists might want to nuance Schmemann by noting that knowledge of death and the ability to mourn the dead can also be observed in other limited animal species, there is no debate that humans have a uniquely complex understanding of the concept of death, which features strongly in human sense of identity and thus our behavioral patterns. So memory, for Father Schmemann, in this way leads to sorrow, as it forces humans to acknowledge the unavoidable fact of death. Through natural memory, humans recognize life as dying. In Schmemann's words, through memory, humans simultaneously resurrect the past and come to know the shatteredness of their own life. Sooner or later, memory itself will darken, weaken, and be snuffed out, and death will reign. So this natural memory, for Schmemann, is in utter contrast to Christian remembrance, which is the essence of the new life given to us in Christ. In the Hebrew Scriptures, the term memory, when attributed to God, often designates an ontological relationship between God and creation. By remembering God, our existence becomes more complete, since our remembrance of Him is a living knowledge. Schmemann writes, if God's remembrance of man is the gift of life, then man's remembrance of God is the reception of this life-creating gift, the constant acquisition of and increase in life. Schmemann is here proposing an ontological understanding of memory, one which also implies that sin can be defined as an act of forgetting God. To forget, in this case, means to cut what has been forgotten off from life, to cease to live by it, to fall away from it. A biblical parallel is found in the book of Deuteronomy, and I quote, "If you forget the Lord your God and follow other gods, serving and worshiping them, I forewarn you this day that you will perish utterly." Here we're not merely describing the person who does not think of God. We're describing an ontological falling away from God, and therefore out of life itself, by ceasing to live through and in Him. By turning away from God, humans do not completely annihilate themselves, nor do they annihilate their memory, i.e. their knowledge of their own life. However, just as life without God is an entrapment in the mutability and corruptibility of time, so too, by not remembering God, our memory reduces to a continuous reminder of the irreturnability of the past, of our life as dying. So the life-giving faculty of Christian remembrance, as described by Father Schmemann, aims to transfigure the natural, death-reminding memory of the human person. This idea is most profoundly expressed through the theology of Eucharistic remembrance of Christ's salvific activity. Yet, as we saw in the first part of this paper, natural memory is involved in every aspect of human life and is essential to our identity as human beings. Thus, if knowledge and encounter with God invites a transfiguration of our memory, there are many practical components of human memory that are by necessity involved in this process. In the final portion of my paper, I would like to turn to some of the practical components of natural memory and how they intersect with the liturgy and life. Now, while neuroscience often speaks of the essential connection between memory and identity, in theological discourse, we underscore liturgy as essential to Christian identity. Liturgy is seen as expressing and forming belief. Liturgy defines the Christian community. Liturgy forms the individual. In this sense, liturgy is also the place par excellence for the formation and recollection of Christian memory. But to what extent does the liturgy operate according to those categories seen as formative in memory formation? Of late, The study of the history of Christian liturgy has witnessed a surge of interest from beyond the traditional domains of its study, like theology or philology. Art historians, cultural historians, and social scientists, many of whom are not Christians alike, have come to see liturgy as an important space for exploring a variety of topics and coming to deeper understanding about the histories of past peoples. The reasons for this are apparent to most practicing Christians. If liturgy was considered essential to a past Christian society, one cannot comprehend that society without understanding its liturgy. An overview of just a small sampling of books on liturgical topics written by non-liturgists will suffice to showcase this phenomenon. Now, the Brown professor and Orthodox scholar of late antiquity, Susan Harvey, in her book Scenting Salvation, explores the role of bodily and sensory experiences in early Christianity, focusing especially on the importance of smell. Derek Kruger's Liturgical Subjects examines how, among other things, Byzantine hymnographers attempted to use poetic expression to unite the emotions of liturgical participants to the emotions of biblical characters, thus weaving contemporary audiences into the biblical story. Kruger's insights on the topic have been built upon and nuanced in numerous studies in the last few years, such as Andrew Irving's work on the intersection of liturgy, hymnody, and the emotions. Art historians such as Robert Nelson and Roland Betancourt have explored the intersection of bodies, liturgical objects, and sacred space, with Nelson also contributing reflections on the interaction of natural light and the performance of the liturgy. These and other art historians have not only come to see the liturgy as key to understanding Byzantine aesthetics, they have also attempted to understand spatial, visual, material, and even acoustic aspects alongside one another. Thus, Bisera Pencheva's work on reconstructing the acoustics of Hagia Sophia seeks to uncover the synergy between acoustics, chant, and the performance of the liturgy. So examined collectively, what these various recent scholarly works have shown is an in-depth and scholarly explication of what many Orthodox and other Christian faithful tend to intuit, namely that the liturgy can be, at least when it is done well, a stimulating sensorial and emotional event, or better yet, an encounter. This encounter shapes individual and communal identity precisely because it is oriented towards God and places present humans within salvation history. If the encoding of memories in the brain tends to be stronger when events are experienced with strong emotions, here we see the liturgy's strong potential to do so. If repetition likewise impacts memory, we see liturgy's insistence on repetitive cycles, whether daily, weekly, or yearly. Liturgy makes use of an entire range of sensorial stimulation, sound, smell, visual drama of art, objects, and contrasts of light and darkness. As neuroscience shows, exceptional sensorial stimulation not only helps with the encoding of memories, but also triggers their recall. This is even more so the case when specific stimuli are isolated to liturgical contexts or embedded with religious meaning. The smell of rosewater on Holy Saturday matins can trigger memories that are innately associated with emotions from when that smell was encoded as a memory. These emotions are in turn tied to the theological and spiritual associations they have held for an individual in past contexts, which the mind can resurrect through recollection and build upon. So I began my paper by pointing out the uniquely complex way in which humans are able to not only encode a memory, like the precise location of hidden nuts. Humans also have the complex ability to remember and connect their memories. Liturgy profits directly from this complexity. The composers of liturgies in centuries past may not have had the precise neuroscientific insight of today, But they nevertheless intuited that sensory stimulation and repetition were central to the liturgy's ability to inspire the formation of long-term memories. And these memories are not those that manifest life as dying, to use Schmemann's phrase. Rather, as remembrance, these memories stem from an encounter with God, the source of life and knowledge. Neuroscience sees human memory as multidirectional. Inscribed in specific parts of our brain, we always physically carry our memories. Recollection is a creative act, during which we stitch back together the pieces of memory that have been deconstructed. Natural scientists tend to interpret this creative act through an evolutionary model whereby we selectively remember and recall things based on their benefit to our survival and well-being in the future. Given the intimate relationship between memory and identity, this evolutionary model conceives of human identity as one first and foremost motivated by survival, that is to say, by survival and gain in this life. Liturgy challenges this model. Yes, all memory is selective and oriented towards the future, but the liturgy is an eschatological event. That is to say, liturgy is an event enfolding in time, in the now, but participating in a reality beyond time, or better put, in God's time. Thus, Church's liturgy takes the mechanisms of human memory in order to encode a theological memory, namely liturgical remembrance, and thus orient humans toward an ultimate future that fulfills the past, namely the eschaton, or the kingdom of God. In the liturgy, Christian remembrance is expressed in all its splendor and fullness. It is the setting where our gaze turns toward the object of the subject of our remembrance, and where the Church enters into the kingdom. This experience transforms human identity. Changed, we return to the world with our eyes still longingly set upon our hope, and with a heart still filled with the sweetness of his myrrh. This becomes our new orientation, not this life, but the kingdom. And in orienting or reorienting our memory, liturgy has the power to transform and transfigure life into worship, and space into the realization of the kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Glibetic, for that compelling and thought-provoking presentation. We have some time now for questions, and if you could come to ask your question here so it can be recorded for Ancient Faith. Come on
up. Professor Glibetic, thank you so much. That was brilliant and very inspiring. I have about 20 questions, and I'll limit myself to one. But actually maybe two. I'd like you to say a little bit more from your knowledge with your expertise about grief and the significance of memory eternal, this prayer that we sing at memorial services and funerals, as you know. I think it ties in with much of what you were saying about the ontology of memory and all of that, but I'd like to hear you say a few words about that. And the second question is not as directly related to this context, but I think one of the things that many of our communities struggle with is the language question, the language of worship. And I wonder if part of the challenge that we face in trying to shift the language of worship, let's say, to the vernacular, isn't also about memory, right? And how we remember, how certain words that we hear, or hymns that we hear in a previous language, bring us to some place. So I was wondering if you could say something about that too.
I'll start with the second question because I think it can easily lead us into the first. Yes, absolutely. I mean, part of memory formation, part of natural memory formation is attentiveness, right? It's sort of being present to what is happening. And what's amazing with liturgy, thinking from the perspective of kind of neuroscience, is that liturgy pulls out all the tricks, right? I mean, right? And so like the entire setting and all the activity and agency within that setting sort of accommodates human fallenness, forgetfulness, right? Lack of attentiveness, all those things, at least tries to, right? And its repetition fills in the gaps, right? And so over time, one really can live the liturgy of the church, right? Language, yes. I mean, it happens all the time when, like in the Serbian church which is my own jurisdiction, we tend to use, Serbian tends to be used by the clergy, and then Church Slavonic tends to be reserved to the choirs, mostly because we haven't transcribed into musical notation a lot of the music. Although we're seeing Serbian also in performance of liturgy. But then here in North America, we've been moving around a lot for different projects and so on. And so when I'm in very Church Slavonic settings, I sometimes witness people when they switch to an English liturgical setting. And all of a sudden you see them really saying, oh, that's what that meant, you know. Sometimes it's like very common phrases, maybe perhaps that they've been singing a huge chunk of their life, right? So yes, we are many things, including cognitive beings, and part of our active liturgy, part of our encounter of God in the liturgy also involves our cognitive processes. He doesn't have to. That's not the only way to encounter God in the liturgy, right? But it's one very profound way to encounter God in the liturgy. And so the liturgy should be intelligible as much as possible. I mean, it's kind of straightforward, right? We carry so much of the kind of tension of cultural change and transformation when we think about the vernacular. And as somebody who works a lot with Church Slavonic texts and Greek texts, I know when I enter in sort of the cultural space of Church Slavonic, and I'm listening to Church Slavonic, I, as a scholar, can in that moment see the richness of a particular word. You know, it's going to trigger me to remember, oh yeah, it's associated perhaps with like pre-Christian and like Greco-Roman thought, right? It has a whole heritage, something sort of I'm teaching my students in class or whatever, you know, like intellectual, theological concepts that are meaningful to me, right? And that's true, right? That's a certain kind of cognitive engagement, a very rich cognitive engagement that sort of transcends cultures, right, or allows a participant to transcend culture. At the same time, I mean, it's not obligatory or necessary at all times, right? So like on a very basic level, yes, the liturgical event is a mystery, but we as cognitive beings participate in this mystery, and all of our personhood should be engaged, right? And it's the church's responsibility to make that as much as it can possible, right? Yeah, in terms of making memory of, in the context of grief, several years ago, a very good friend of mine who was, she's a Serbian woman who lived in Bosnia, and she was very much loved by the local church and the local monastic community, and it's a very kind of youthful diocese, and she passed away very young. She was with a car accident. It was a total shock for the whole community. The local monastery invited her. They knew how much she loved the monastery, so she was buried at the monastery, and the whole community came. It was a very kind of moving, kind of transformative moment for a lot of people. But everybody kind of spontaneously burst into the resurrection troparia, you know, as part of her funeral rites, because it was just so clear to everybody, like that the sort of our belief in the resurrection was going to kind of transfigure the grief in that moment. And it wasn't just like a thing of hope. Yes, it's a thing of hope, right? But we really do believe that liturgy is truly an encounter with God, right? And also with the assembled church that exists in time and outside time, right? It's the great paradox of Christianity, right? And so we liturgically truly encounter those we pray for, right? And so, yes, and that sounds like a lot of liturgical theology, but just in my own personal life, I've felt that many times, you know, where I just kind of, things happen in liturgical settings or not, or I'm like, oh, like I just kind of into it. I can just see, right? There's kind of a certain bridge, just kind of, I can just see somebody important to me who may not have been declared a saint, but who I know is a saint, like who I know is with God in the kingdom, is telling me something I need to hear, right? So I think without the incarnation, grief is unbearable, right? Like it's really the incarnation. And I think that which is not just sort of, lots of other religions sort of deal with grief in a lot of different ways, and some of those are very fruitful, But just to say that we're talking about incarnate God, we're talking about a God who is outside time, beyond time, the creator of time, amongst other things, right? Who enters into time, like sort of self-empties, right? Particularly to burst this limitations of history into eternity, right? And so to pull us with him, right? And so there's really no other more profound source of hope, right?
I don't know if the microphone is on, but so also thank you. Sorry. So in one of the previous workshops, we talked about forgiveness and sort of on the flip side of memory eternal. I guess I was wondering if you could speak sometimes when we encounter, whether in others or in ourselves, our own experiences of grief can sometimes cause us to forget. And there's a way that sometimes that forgetting can be quite healing and quite beautiful, and glory to God, we can kind of forget things and are able to move on. And other times, even though we might forget maybe sort of on a cognitive level, we still bear those marks.
Right.
Even though Lord, though when he was resurrected, he still bore his wounds. And I guess I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that, and sometimes remembering those painful memories can be quite difficult and painful. Sometimes they're healing and beautiful, but just as often they're not.
It's making me think of another question I once had about the sacrament of penance, right, of confession. And the way the question was posed, it sort of suggested that with penance, we sort of let go of our sin, like our sin is kind of washed away, right? Our sin is gone. And my reaction was to say, well, no, like who we are, our past is always in our present. And so our actions can be transfigured in a context of confession, right? But they don't cease to be part of us, right? God can forgive them. We can forgive ourselves. Others can forgive us. But that experience is still integral to our identity, like sort of like our personhood always stretches into the past of our lives. There's just like no way around it. That's just a kind of a side note. Yes, memory is always selective. It's the nature of historical space-time. We can never recreate the past, right? I can never bring back a past moment. So memory selects. And there's a whole range of explanations why and how that process works with selectivity. And here is where I, in some ways, maybe challenge in my own work neuroscientific approaches, because it really is so evolutionary, model-centered. But in other words, I think that's kind of a restricted model that you naturally arrive at if you don't have things like remembrance and eschatology, right? So it also makes sense. So we're always forgetting, but we always carry our past with us. And so there's things we might try to intentionally forget, but we carry in other ways with us. We carry it in our bodies, right? Yes. And the activity of the church, the sacramental activity of the church, is not to throw the past away ever, but is to bring the past into the kingdom, right? So I don't know if I've answered that question. Is there something specific that you had in mind?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Just beautiful. And I'm blind, obviously, but part of your talk was very powerful to me, because you said memory is if you stop and actually think, I want to remember this, that it actually can help your memory. And I do remember when I was told I was going to go blind as a young boy, I always remember stopping and saying, Lord, please let me remember this sunset on a lake in northern Minnesota. And I still can to this day, even though I can't see today. So it's very, very powerful. But my question is, if what I'm hearing you say, then like I'm thinking like when our kids are young and for parents, for encouragement, that repetition and the sensual elements of, kissing icons or the incense or, or what you were just saying about confession, if they go to confession at a young age and it's a positive experience, even though they're 10 years old, they're confessing they got angry at their brother and the priest is loving, whatever, that these repetitive things actually do stick with them. Because I think as parents, we always kind of wonder, our kids are running around or yelling during liturgy, and it's like, is this really, so could you just address that as from like a parental perspective?
Yes, and I would, for kids it's sort of obvious, but I think the physicality of our life is something, and so going through processes in a physical way is something that is always a necessary pedagogical tool, right? Like there's really no even intellectual processes without the body, right? So even for adults, I would say the same thing, right? Yes. To speak from my own personal life, so I have 3 kids, and we live so I work at University of Notre Dame. We're in Indiana for a big chunk of the year. And then in the summers and late fall, late spring, we go to Serbia, where my son, who is upstairs ignoring me on his phone right now, where he actually goes to Serbian school for a couple of months. And the Serbian education model, although in a state of transformation itself, sort of follows the more classical model in the sense of like repetition, memory work, right? And so I spent a lot of time thinking about the 2 models, right, where in North America there's a certain emphasis placed on kind of critical reflection, right? And these are kind of stereotypes too. I don't mean to say that this is sort of absolute, right? But I see him having to memorize songs, like epic poetry, like having to memorize a whole list of names and dates and peoples, right, in a way that I don't see him doing here. So people will say he doesn't, that model of education doesn't necessarily work because you forget that over time. And you do forget that over time. And if that knowledge isn't deepened as we transform in time, who we are, you can sort of lose it, but something does stay, right? So it's this, what's really cool about the structure of the liturgy and the structure of ritual in general, but liturgy of course is unique, is that it persistently insists on certain physical, spiritual, mental, kind of cognitive process, and that through its repetition is always new, even on a very natural level, because we're never the same, right? But it's also always new in the sense that it's an encounter of God, right? Yes. I mean, on a very, absolutely. Sacramental participation radically shapes our identity, and it's something that kids carry with them in a way that we can't even necessarily pinpoint later in life, right?
I don't have a question, but I have a funny story that relates to your presentation that I think you and the audience would appreciate. So I have to give a little background because I don't want to scandalize people with what exchange happened in this classroom. As a professor and a student at the seminary. Professor had a personality that everyone understood. They still loved him in his different ways. The student was one of those students, any of you who are professors, you always have an annoying student. This was between a professor at the seminary and an annoying student that everyone still loved him, but he was an annoying student. So it kind of goes like this. The student was challenging this professor and talking to him about things that the professor wasn't covering. And the professor says, "Would you just shut up? I have forgotten more than you will ever learn."
They'll have to use that on my students. Thank you, everyone.
So I'm sorry, I just wanted to, it's not a question, it's just something to think about. Many of us here may have heard of the book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yes.
This is one of the best books that I've read. I think it's something that everybody, medicine, psychology, religion, should read about memory and trauma. And so, anyways, I just thank you for your presentation, and I just wanted to share that with everybody.
Thank you. Yes, I know the book is